December 7, 1902. The Caribbean Sea off the coast of La Guaira, Venezuela. The dawn is not quiet. It is broken by the low, resonant groan of coal-fired engines and the smell of salt water and smoke. The water, usually a brilliant turquoise, is darkened by long, predatory shadows. Not the shadows of clouds, but of steel. 12 warships, British, German, and Italian, form a loose, menacing crescent in the international waters just outside Venezuela's principal port. Aboard the HMS Ariadne, a British admiral scans the coastline through a brass telescope. On the SMS Vinta, a German captain orders his gunnery officers to their stations. There is a chilling, bureaucratic precision to the movements. This is not an act of declared war. It is, in their eyes, a debt collection. But for the fishermen in their wooden piraguas who scramble to get out of the channel, and for the dockworkers on the shore who stop, shielding their eyes from the rising sun to stare at the impossible sight, it feels like the end of their world. For months, the voice of President Cipriano Castro, the fiery, defiant leader known as the Lion of the Andes, has crackled over telegraph wires, proclaiming Venezuela's sovereignty against the great powers of Europe. He inherited a nation drowning in debt, owed to foreign banks and investors from London, Berlin, and Rome. Castro's stance was simple, almost taunting. Venezuela would pay on its own terms or not at all. The European powers, their patience and their ledger books exhausted, had now come to collect, not with lawyers but with broadside guns and naval infantry. The tension on those European decks is a different kind. It is the tension of imperial presumption. For Britain, the world's paramount naval power, this is a minor policing action to protect its bondholders, a simple reminder of the global order. For Kaiser Wilhelm II's Germany, a hungry, late-arriving empire desperate for its place in the sun, the blockade is an opportunity. It is a chance to demonstrate naval might, to plant a flag, however temporarily, in America's hemisphere, and to test the limits of a new, uncertain doctrine emerging from Washington, D.C., the Monroe Doctrine. For decades, that doctrine had been a statement of principle largely unenforced. The question hanging in the salty air, thicker than the coal smoke, is simple. Will the United States actually defend it? The answer initially seems to be no. In Washington, President Theodore Roosevelt is wrestling with a complex chessboard. He is a man who believes in American power, who just a year earlier subtly encouraged the secession of Panama from Colombia to build his canal. But he is also a realist. He knows America's Navy, though growing, is not yet ready to challenge the Royal Navy and the German High Seas Fleet simultaneously. His official response is cautious, urging arbitration. But privately in the halls of the White House and intense diplomatic cables, a fury builds. Roosevelt sees the blockade for what it is. A blatant violation of the hemisphere he believes America is destined to lead. He sees the German warships in particular as a direct threat. What if they decide not to leave? What if this debt collection becomes a permanent occupation? Back off the coast of La Guaira, the standoff hardens. The European ships halt all maritime traffic. Venezuelan ports freeze. The nation's economy, reliant on coffee and cocoa exports, begins to strangle. President Castro, from his palace in Caracas, refuses to blink, rallying his people with promises of national dignity. The European admirals, their ultimatums ignored, prepare to escalate. The peace of the Caribbean is now measured in hours. All it will take is a single refused demand, a single nervous gunner, to transform a financial dispute into an act of war on American soil, soil that the United States had declared 80 years prior off limits to old world empires. The cannon are loaded. The gunners have their coordinates, and in the White House, Theodore Roosevelt's patience, like Venezuela's coastline, is about to be breached. December 13, 1902. Puerto Cabello, Venezuela. The heat is oppressive, a physical weight pressing down on the ancient stone battlements of Fort San Carlos, a Spanish colonial fortress guarding one of Venezuela's most important harbors. Inside the fort, a young Venezuelan artillery officer, his uniform soaked with sweat, peers through a narrow embrasure. His view is not of a historic coastline, but of the sleek gray silhouette of the German-protected cruiser SMS Panther, anchored insolently close. For 6 days, the blockade has been a tense, floating siege. But now a new phase begins. A German landing party in pristine white uniforms rows toward the docks in a precise, intimidating launch. Their mission, to seize several Venezuelan gunboats, the tiny, aging fleet of President Castro huddled in the inner harbor. It is an act of confiscation, a tangible stripping of sovereignty. On the Panther, Captain Rudolf von Colland watches through his binoculars. His orders from Berlin are clear. Increase the pressure until Castro capitulates. The rules of engagement, drawn up in distant European admiralties, allow for the neutralization of Venezuelan military assets. But in the sweltering confusion of a foreign port, rules blur. As the German sailors move to take control of the gunboat 23 de Mayo, shouting in a language the Venezuelan guards do not understand, a shot rings out. Who fired first is lost to history. A nervous German seaman, a defiant Venezuelan guard, but the crack of the rifle is a spark in a powder keg. From the ramparts of Fort San Carlos, the order is given. The old coastal guns, relics from a previous century, roar to life. Their aim is poor, their shells sending up great plumes of white water near the Panther. But the message is unequivocal: Venezuela will fight. The Panther's response is swift, modern, and devastating. Its 105 quick-firing guns pivot, a mechanical ballet of lethal precision. Within minutes, a storm of high-explosive shells screams toward the fort. Stonework that had stood for centuries is pulverized. The fort's flagpole is sheared in half, the Venezuelan tricolor fluttering down into the dust and smoke. The bombardment lasts for an hour, a brutal, one-sided display of technological disparity. When the guns fall silent, Fort San Carlos is a ruin, its brave defiance crushed under the weight of German naval artillery. News of the bombardment travels via telegraph cable at the speed of electricity. It reaches the German and British foreign ministries, where it is logged as an unfortunate but necessary escalation in a justified intervention. It reaches Caracas, where Cipriano Castro uses the rubble of the fort as the ultimate propaganda symbol of European barbarism, rallying his nation for a protracted guerrilla resistance in the interior. But most importantly, it clicks across the submarine cable to Washington, D.C. and the White House. Theodore Roosevelt receives the report. The abstract principle of the Monroe Doctrine has just been violated with concrete shells. The police action has become a bombardment. For Roosevelt, the calculus shifts irrevocably. The European powers are no longer just collecting a debt. They are conducting a war of conquest on a republic in America's sphere. His earlier caution evaporates, replaced by the strategic mind of a naval historian and the blunt force of his personality. He summons the German ambassador, Theodor von Holleben. The meeting is not in the diplomatic Oval Office, but in the more intimate president's study. Roosevelt does not mince words. He lays out a new, stark reality. The United States cannot and will not tolerate the seizure of Venezuelan territory or the permanent impairment of its sovereignty. He implies heavily that if Germany does not agree to submit the entire debt dispute to international arbitration at The Hague, and does not agree to do so immediately, he will order the U.S. Atlantic Fleet, under the command of Admiral George Dewey, the hero of Manila Bay, to sail to Venezuelan waters. The unstated threat is clear. The next fleet the Germans see on the horizon will be flying the stars and stripes, and it will be prepared to enforce the peace. Roosevelt then delivers a masterstroke of diplomatic theater. He informs the ambassador that, as a courtesy, he has already drafted the orders to Admiral Dewey. The fleet is coaled, manned, and ready to depart from Norfolk at a moment's notice. The ambassador, stunned, argues that his government in Berlin must be consulted. Roosevelt, according to later accounts, gives him a deadline, 48 hours. The clock is ticking. The bombing of Fort San Carlos has not broken Venezuela, it has awakened the United States. The crisis is no longer about Venezuela's debts. It is now about who controls the destiny of the Western Hemisphere. December 16, 1902. Washington, D.C. A freezing rain pelts the windows of the State, War, and Navy building next to the White House. Inside, under the glow of electric lamps, the air is thick with the smell of wet wool, cigar smoke, and high-stakes anxiety. Theodore Roosevelt paces like a caged bull. The 48-hour deadline he had given the German ambassador is evaporating, minute by minute. From Berlin, there is only silence. From the British, polite but non-committal statements about the need to protect their citizens' investments. The reports from Puerto Cabello detail the scale of the destruction at Fort San Carlos. For Roosevelt, each hour of delay is another hour of European guns dictating terms in an American republic. It is an intolerable erosion of U.S. credibility and of his own. He stops pacing and turns to his Secretary of State, John Hay, and his naval advisors. His decision is made. The time for tacit threats is over. He orders the telegraph office to send the pre-written, coded cables to Norfolk, Virginia. The Great White Fleet is not yet white. Its famous paint scheme is still years away. But the battleships and cruisers of the North Atlantic Squadron are a formidable gray mass in the icy waters of Hampton Roads. Aboard his flagship, the USS Kearsarge, Admiral George Dewey receives the electrifying order: raise steam and prepare to sail for Venezuela. Dewey, the man who destroyed the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay, understands the mission implicitly. This is not a routine maneuver. It is a show of force of the highest diplomatic order. By nightfall, the harbor is a scene of controlled chaos. Coal barges are lashed alongside the great warships, their holds being filled to capacity. Steam winches hoist last-minute supplies, and every man aboard knows they are not heading for a friendly port. Simultaneously, Roosevelt authorizes a public declaration, a shot across the bow in the newspapers. The United States government formally demands that all parties, Britain, Germany, and Italy, agree to unconditional arbitration at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. The statement is couched in the language of peaceful resolution, but its subtext, printed in every major paper from New York to San Francisco, is unmistakable. America is drawing a line. The New York Sun captures the mood with the headline, "The Monroe Doctrine, ROOSEVLT puts teeth in it." The reaction in European capitals is one of shock and sudden, urgent recalculation. In London, the British government, entangled in its own imperial concerns and facing a rising Germany in the North Sea, performs a swift and pragmatic about-face. They have less to prove and more to lose from a clash with the United States. Lord Lansdowne at the Foreign Office quietly signals Washington that Britain will accept arbitration. Italy, a minor player in the squadron, quickly follows suit. But Berlin remains the problem. Kaiser Wilhelm II is furious, his pride wounded. To back down under American pressure is a public humiliation. His naval advisors, however, present a cold, logistical reality. The German fleet in the Caribbean is powerful but isolated. Dewey's fleet, steaming south, would be operating near its home bases. A transatlantic war with the United States over Venezuelan bond payments is strategic insanity. The Chancellor, Bernhard von Bülow, works frantically to convince the Kaiser. The diplomatic cables between Berlin and Washington hum with frantic, last-minute negotiations. Roosevelt, sensing the weakness, adds final, irresistible pressure. He instructs the American ambassador in Berlin to request a personal, urgent audience with the Kaiser. The message to be delivered is blunt. If Germany does not publicly agree to arbitration before Dewey's fleet makes landfall in Venezuelan waters, the United States will interpret any further hostile action against Venezuela as an act of aggression against American interests. The unspoken conclusion: the U.S. Navy will intervene militarily on the side of Venezuela. On December 18th, the standoff breaks. The German government, facing the prospect of a naval war it cannot win and a diplomatic catastrophe, capitulates. They agree to arbitration. The news reaches Washington as Roosevelt is preparing for his evening meal. He allows himself a tight, victorious smile. The European blockade will remain in place for several more weeks, a face-saving measure, but its teeth have been pulled. The guns are silent. The crisis has passed its climax not in the Caribbean, but in the telegraph rooms and strategy sessions of Washington and Berlin. Admiral Dewey's fleet is ordered to stand down, but remains at a state of high readiness. The message has been sent and received. For the first time in its history, the United States has used the imminent threat of its naval power to dictate terms to the great empires of Europe in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine is no longer a statement of aspiration. It is now a policy of enforcement, backed by steel and coal and the will of a president who has just rewritten the rules of hemispheric power. February 1903. The Hague, Netherlands, and the Caribbean Sea. In the hallowed, quiet halls of the Peace Palace at The Hague, a court of arbitration convenes. The air is cold, the proceedings are glacial, and the language is the dry, precise legalese of international law. Delegates from Britain, Germany, Italy, and Venezuela sit at polished mahogany tables, arguing over percentages, interest rates, and the validity of decades-old bonds. The gavel falls on a decision. The European powers were, in fact, entitled to use force to collect their debts. Venezuela would have to pay. But in a critical nuance, the court also rules that the blockading powers do not have priority over other creditor nations for payment. It is a diplomatic compromise, a face-saving exit for all parties. The European squadrons, their mission technically validated but strategically thwarted, slowly raise anchor and steam back across the Atlantic, their guns cold and their ambitions in the Americas permanently checked. But the true verdict was not rendered in The Hague. It was written in the wake of the American fleet at Norfolk and in the defiant cables from the White House. The aftermath of the Venezuelan crisis does not settle like dust. It crystallizes into a new, unshakable doctrine of American foreign policy. Theodore Roosevelt, a historian who understood the power of defining a moment, seizes upon the event. In his address to Congress in December 1904, he articulates what will become known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The words are carefully chosen, but their meaning is revolutionary. Chronic wrongdoing, Roosevelt declares, may in America as elsewhere ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, and in the Western Hemisphere the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. The implications ripple across the globe. The Monroe Doctrine, once a passive shield telling Europe, "Thou shalt not," has been transformed into an active sword for the United States, stating, "We alone shall." America has appointed itself the hemisphere's policeman, loan collector, and stability enforcer. The immediate effect is a dramatic shift in perception. In the chancelleries of London, Paris, and Berlin, the United States is no longer seen as a boisterous regional power, but as a genuine imperial force, one that commands its own sphere of influence with the same authority Britain held over its empire. The era of European military intervention in Latin America is, for all intents and purposes, over. In Latin America itself, the reaction is a complex cocktail of relief and profound resentment. The relief is palpable in the moment. The European guns are gone, the immediate threat of colonization has receded. But a new, more intimate anxiety takes its place. For leaders and intellectuals from Mexico City to Buenos Aires, the Roosevelt Corollary is a patronizing declaration of hemispheric supremacy. The United States has not saved them from Europe. It has merely replaced Europe as the ultimate arbiter of their sovereignty. The patron in Washington now claims the right to judge their civilization, their wrongdoing, and their impotence. This new reality is made concrete in the years that follow. The U.S. Navy becomes a permanent, powerful presence in the Caribbean. American Marines land in Honduras, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti over the coming decades, often to oversee customs houses and manage debts. Precisely the same pretext used by the Europeans in 1902, but now under an American flag and an American duty. The Panama Canal, whose construction began just months after the crisis, is both a symbol and a tool of this new power, requiring the constant protection of the Navy Roosevelt had so boldly deployed. The Venezuelan Crisis of 1902-1903 is the forgotten hinge. It marks the precise moment the United States stepped onto the world stage as a global power, not with a declaration of war, but with a threat of war it was prepared to execute. It ended 1 century of American isolation and hesitancy, and began another of American intervention and oversight. The bombs that fell on Fort San Carlos did not just shatter Spanish colonial stone, they shattered the old world order in the Americas. In the silence that followed, the only power left speaking was the United States, and its voice, for better and for worse, would echo across the hemisphere for the next 100 years.